Okay, welcome, thank you. My name is Larry Kramer. I am presently with the president of the Hewlett Foundation, and I'm chairing this panel, which has the very narrow focus of privacy and security. We can think about this, and I want to sort of open this up just by putting out some of the problems. And as with all of these plenary panels, we're not looking at this to come up with answers for you all, but really to flush out a lot of the issues that will then get talked about in the subsequent breakout sessions. So if you think about this, there are sort of two big problems that we want to surface for you. The first is the general problem: how should we balance privacy and security? So think of that as a domestic problem. When you think about that balance, the obvious tensions, and they're familiar to everyone in this room, but is this a zero-sum game? Is it necessarily the case that any steps that we take to protect security require a trade-off on privacy, or any steps we take to enlarge or secure privacy rights require a trade-off on security? And if it is, then how should we think about making that trade-off? And if it's not, then how do you identify the mutual gains from trade that are conceivable or plausible there and realize them? And hopefully I should say it's not, but we'll see what the panelists say. Second, however any particular country chooses to balance privacy and security interests, one thing we can count on to an absolute certainty is that other countries are going to balance that differently. Now, obviously, that would not be a problem if all of the issues of cyber threats were confined within national borders, but just as obviously they're not. And so that's where the problem comes from. Companies operate and have interests across boundaries. The internet is itself inherently global, and that's both not just as a matter of usage, but also technologically and in terms of the way it actually works. Those who want to misuse the technology are operating across boundaries, whether that's governments that are hostile to each other, terrorists, criminals, or just simple mischief makers. So how can the international community realistically accommodate the competing visions that they will have of the different balances between security and privacy? And I want to emphasize the realistically in that question, right? A simple answer would be if they would just agree on a single balance, but we can assume going in that that's just never going to happen, or at least not for a very, very long time. And so the problem comes back to us in how to accommodate different competing visions of how to protect these interests and what kind of trade-offs to make. And the other part of the realistically that I think people need to keep in mind is that one end of the spectrum is let's have one simple agreement on what we'll all do. The other end of the spectrum would be the least common denominator, the lowest common denominator. And assuming that's also not an ideal solution, the question is what can we do that's better than that? Now, I just want to briefly sharpen the stakes on those questions by using an example, just to flush out some of the issues and keep them in mind. And I say this, we talked about this before, this example is not meant to be the thing about which we'll talk, but simply to give some concreteness to the kinds of questions which may work itself as an example or may actually make people think of all the other examples that aren't captured in this one. And I'm not thinking here about the revelations exposed by Edward Snowden. I thought that's kind of too easy a target. So I have in mind something more like the Boston Marathon bombing. So the actual case is pretty familiar. Tamerlan Tsarnaev emigrates to the US as a child. At some point, he begins to radicalize, goes and spends 6 months in Dagestan, comes home, plans a bombing with his brother. He may or may not have made contacts or learned about building the bomb while in Dagestan. What was interesting was, to me, one thing, was afterwards, even as the government was being heavily criticized for its surveillance, actually even then, now much more so, but for its surveillance efforts and intrusions on privacy, it was simultaneously criticized for having overlooked or missed the evidence of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's web connections and contacts that would have given them a suggestion that he might do this. So you see the inherent tension there. Putting aside the sort of easy response, well, if the government can't catch him, then why should we let them do this at all? And recognizing that these efforts may, in fact, be necessary to yield some kind of protection, but also the fraught consequences as we try to balance. The question is, domestically, how should we think about what the government can and should do in terms of surveilling people to both prevent that kind of thing and protect our own privacy when we want to make whatever web connections and contacts we might have in mind? So that's the domestic question. Now you can imagine, and we don't know this for sure, but imagine that it was while he was in Russia that Tsarnaev made his contacts. But you can imagine the Russian government being indifferent to what's happening there with respect to people developing plans to cause harm in other countries as opposed to in Russia itself. You can imagine a government that might be too weak or incompetent to actually deal with those problems, or you can imagine a government that's even in favor of having it happen. Now, I'm not saying that Russia was any of those three, but it's not too hard to think of governments in the world that would fall into each of those categories. And then the question again is, so how is a country like, say, the US in this hypothetical supposed to protect itself? If it cannot count on the other country to take the steps that are necessary to eliminate or defer threats that are going to cross borders into our country, then what is the appropriate kind of action, and how should we accommodate those kinds of interests? So to think about those two, that's the international question. And to think about those two questions and how we might deal, and we have a superb panel of people with very different kinds of experience to help us, as I say, flush out some of these issues. To my immediate left is Bill Woodcock, who is currently the executive director of the Packet Clearinghouse. Next over is Samir Bhalotra, who currently is the chief operating officer of Impermium, but is here as much for his job before that, which was as senior director for cybersecurity in the White House. Then to his left is Beatrice Covassi, who is the digital economy counselor to the EU delegation to the United States. And finally, at the end, my former colleague and close friend Abe Sofair, who is currently the George P. Shultz Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy and National Security Affairs at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford, but before that served as a U.S. District Court judge and was legal advisor in the Department of State for 5 years, 1985 till 90. There are fuller bios of all of these people in the materials, but since we don't have a whole lot of time, I just wanted you to know who they are and so you have a sense of what to expect. So let me start, Bill, with you, and just put out the general question, which is in the domestic. If we just think about the problem of balancing privacy and security, and the government's making the claim of the need to collect and aggregate a lot of information so that they can protect the citizens of the country and the infrastructure and all of that. Is that a zero-sum game? How do you think about that? How should we think about that? What are the difficult issues?
I think the general rubric under which the problems with this are described as big data, right? So here in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of people concerned with big data and how to manage it and what the problems with managing it are. So we can look to that. There are not problems here that the intelligence sector is facing that are essentially different from those the private sector faces. The private sector collects this data for the purposes of marketing and advertising and doing business. The intelligence sector collects it for prurient reasons and, sorry. So the two big problems there are de-anonymization and correlation. So if you're worrying about privacy and you've got these big data sets out there, multiple data sets collected in different ways, the first thing is that people can take parts of that data and bring it together to infer things about individuals that would not otherwise have been obvious, that those individuals think were private. Put together a plane ticket here and a credit card transaction there and a car rental receipt here and so forth, and suddenly you know something about that person believed and had reason to believe that they were doing in privacy. Obviously, for law enforcement, this is a requirement. But when you're not doing it for law enforcement purposes, you're not doing it in order to enforce a law upon a person who's doing a crime, but you're doing it in the general case, then suddenly there's a legal problem with doing that, and it's a legal problem that the government is encountering right now. The second problem is de-anonymization. So there are many, many instances where people believe that they've taken a large data set and made it safe somehow by taking out certain pieces of information that they think are the personally identifiable information. So for instance, the census collects a vast amount of data that people would not give if they thought it was going to be attributed to them individually. And that data gets aggregated and published. But that data, combined with other data sources that both the private sector and the public sector have access to, those can be put back together to de-anonymize and figure out specific information about specific people. There are zip plus 4 zip codes that only have one person in them, for instance. So I think there's a huge inherent danger in just having these big masses of data sitting around, having collected information without a specific need or for a different purpose, and leaving it sitting around makes it a really attractive target to people who would use it for all kinds of bad purposes, whether those people are corrupt government officials or hackers or industrial espionage practitioners or whatever. And data tends to multiply, right? So somebody hacks in, steals a database, now there are 2 copies of it. And now you've got 2 different security regimes to worry about. One maintained by an incompetent government agency, the other maintained by a cyber criminal. Okay, so now somebody else is going to hack into one of those. Now there are going to be 3 copies. Pretty soon the data multiplies out of control. And having collected the data unnecessarily in the first place is really the root of that problem. The data is big and expensive to collect, but having collected it, it costs even more to get rid of it.
So just very quick, I'm not sure why the data was collected unnecessarily. The way you talked about it, it sounds like from the perspective of a government concerned about security, actually they collected it for exactly the reasons you gave, which is they could look for patterns and put things together and find threats.
But do they successfully do so? Ever? Maybe. When they're attacked, they trot out a few examples that they say, were successful. And, you look at that in the private sector and say, well, if I had to go out for funding based on that, I certainly wouldn't have gotten it. But in the public sector, they don't have to justify their actions and budgets and so forth quite as...
So this is actually good, Samir, to turn, so you were in the White House, so is this worth doing? Is it effective enough to make it, and is that all that there is to it? If it's effective, then it's okay, even though the same concerns are raised that Bill talks about.
Yeah, this is a great point. Just quickly, I want to thank John and Bruce for inviting me here today, and also Chris Painter, a good colleague of mine. Happy to see you here again today. This is actually the first topic I wanted to raise. I'm now in the startup sector here, running a startup company, but I'm going to talk about my government days. Brushed off my time, put it on for you. Effectiveness was a major topic of discussion in the government, and I think both in cybersecurity, where I focused, but also in surveillance, where I worked before in the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee. And you hear the legislators and the overseers talk about effectiveness of the programs. Terrorist attacks that have been stopped, right? Dangerous people who have been found. But I think it is difficult for most people on the outside of those closed groups to make the judgment on their own. And maybe to even trust that their legislators who have that closed access have made the right judgment. So it is definitely debated both in cybersecurity and surveillance whether the effectiveness is there. But I think it's hard to relay that to other people with confidence. And I think that's a weakness. That goes to my second point, which is transparency. Obviously a big theme here, right? Transparency of the effectiveness of a program. Is the security gain worth the political risk and the potential of abuse of dangerous and powerful technology, right? But other types of transparency, for example, to reassure U.S. citizens, in the case of the United States, what the government might be doing with data inadvertently collected on them or purposely collected on them, what can and can't be done. I think transparency there would go a long way, and I think there's a way to do more there without giving a roadmap to the bad guys about exactly how to defeat those security systems. A third point that comes up a lot is oversight systems. So this is not so exciting for the press to write about, courts and congressional overseers, but actually in the government it's something that we thought about a lot. And I worked on both sides, in the Congress and then in the White House afterwards. And I think there's been a lot of attention paid to oversight systems for surveillance, right? It's a complicated structure of intelligence committees, secret courts, parts of the government, Department of Justice overseers, reports. But it doesn't seem to really be satisfying the country. And I think many legislators have taken a step back lately and thought, post-Snowden, do we have the right oversight system in place to have confidence ourselves that our intelligence systems are following the law? And then to be able to relay that confidence credibly to the country or to foreign leaders that the right things are actually happening here. A fourth point that I wanted to raise here that is discussed a lot in the government is the impact on business. So now being a businessman, Bill being a businessman, I have to raise this topic. In the case of cybersecurity, in my experience, a lot of attention was paid to the impact to business of new government regulation, information sharing, liability, immunity, even new types of criminal penalties for different types of breaches. And I think you see that in the cybersecurity legislative debate in the United States playing out. There's a difficult balance between forcing industry to protect themselves better and being careful about the negative impact to innovation of doing that. I think in surveillance it's less clear, and now we're starting to see that come out, whether the government has properly taken into account the negative impact to business. Perhaps US businesses who want to operate overseas, the risk of balkanizing, right? Parts of the way the internet operates if everyone has their own local controlled internet and cloud services instead of sharing in global services. And I think perhaps the government could do a better job balancing the business risks there. So those are four topics that I found carried through both cybersecurity and surveillance topics where I think we could do a better job.
Does that work for you? I mean, I'm curious, you know, is your only concern about the efficacy of this relative to the information collected and, you know, so that if we do that with a degree of transparency, then, you know, go to it, government?
Well, I think there's a big danger, which is that the analysis is much more difficult than the collection. And right now, there's a huge amount of money being spent on collection, and presumably correspondingly less spent on analysis, and thus the efficacy is not very good. The problem is that when you've got a big general problem, analysis is difficult. Databases work really well if you want a specific answer that you want to pluck out of them. But if you are trying to correlate big general trends through a whole bunch of large databases, the problem gets very vague and computationally intensive, and the results, the confidence of the results gets very low. So when government is trying to say who might in the future do a crime where crime is very loosely defined, that's a hard problem. When a criminal says, well, I see the government has these three databases, and if I pluck specific records out of those three databases, I can impersonate somebody successfully and empty the money out of their bank account, right? This is a very easy problem by comparison. So we have government trying to solve a very hard problem and throwing insufficient resources at it to succeed, whereas they create this danger to everyone by doing it. And, you know, as Samir says, the transparency is absolutely necessary in government functions, especially when they're posing a danger to citizens. And at the same time, I know a lot of people who are most frustrated about the whole NSA thing in that we've spent all this money, taxpayer dollars into it, and they were incompetent. They got caught, right? So at the very least, we would expect them to do their job without failing in that basic principle of not getting caught. So, you know, there are two sides to the transparency thing as well. Now that everybody knows that they've been doing all this, you're seeing, on the one hand, court subpoenas for records that would exonerate someone who's accused of a crime, but on the other hand, I'm sure there are plenty of cyber criminals who are, you know, going after that data for their own purposes. So, yeah, the impact on business, yeah, I think is a huge one. The impact on personal privacy is a huge one. The benefits, frankly, aren't very obvious to me.
I want to just build on this with one comment. I think these are some great points. In the US, at least, there is a clear difference in what the government does with metadata and with content. And actually, I'd love a discussion later in the day about how this plays out in other countries. You know, the rules are different for the intelligence community to collect metadata, which is what phone number called what number, what email address talked to who at what time, versus content, which is actually what was said, what you said, the words you used. And as you know, based on, I think, original constitutional differences and then case law that's played out over time, different rules apply to collecting that metadata, especially on US persons, versus content. Different rules apply to what you can do with it, how long you can keep it, expectation of privacy. And I think that that difference is a risk in the United States, right? I wonder how that plays out in other countries.
Well, let's actually take that as an excuse to turn to Beatrice and, you know, give us your perspective on this from the European Union side.
Well, grazie, and first of all, thank you for having me here and bringing a European Union perspective. I'm pleased that there are some member states as well in the room. Hope we could be more at this event. And And when I saw the title of this panel, actually, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be all about Snowden. I'm glad that is not the case. But let me just say at the outset that is it a zero-sum game? It is not much so. It's so not a zero-sum game for the EU, as I'm sure you are aware. And let me quote the European Council, what just took place in October. The European Council said that having a strong European general data protection framework and a cybersecurity directive in place, legislation in place, is absolutely paramount to have a digital internal market by 2015. So they go hand in hand. Is it a minimum common denominator? I want to be a bit provocative as well. For Europe, it will be the highest common denominator when it comes to data privacy and data protection. So it is a difficult balance that we are facing as well, but we are working on both fronts at the moment. So we have this new, the first European cybersecurity strategy in place, and we have the first vote that took place recently as well on the data protection legislation. We are trying to maximize both and to take them hand in hand.
So I'm not even sure what, it's interesting, I said lowest common denominator, and now I'm thinking, I'm not sure what highest common denominator means, because that means maximum protection of privacy or maximum protection of security, and is it the highest one then lowest of the other?
No, I think it would, they go hand in hand, but we have, as you know, a special sensitivity when it comes to data privacy. So it is something that will be maybe less negotiable, or less on the negotiating table than in other parts of the world. And this is also a reason why we have not decided to take it as part of the negotiations, of the commercial negotiations, because it's still a fundamental right and it belongs elsewhere. So I suspect that when it comes to privacy, we think that also companies, if they have to adapt to European rules, they would go for the higher protection while going for the lower protection. And this eventually, might result in an alignment internationally.
So let's now move this just a little bit out into the international domain. And, you've got even just here some different views on how to think about the problem. So, based on your experience, how are we going to solve those differences internationally?
The interest in protecting cybersecurity is not inconsistent, in my view, with freedom and privacy. On the contrary, security is a prerequisite to real freedom and privacy. And in that sense, I think that can be shown in many ways. And what you've witnessed here today with a minister from China telling us about the horrible situation that exists in China with massive attacks on its system, interference with the activities of its nationals, matches what you've heard from repeatedly over the last few years about these massive on our systems, interference with our companies and our individuals. Yet, we've had a consistent view from the United States that we can deliver cybersecurity to our people without any kind of international agreement. Our government has been gradually willing to say things like they're now going to sit down and talk to foreign countries about norms of conduct and things of that sort. But we were here at Stanford with CSAC and the Hoover and everybody else at the table from the university and many experts from all over the world looking at cybersecurity and international affairs some 10 years ago. And we were driven to the conclusion that we needed an international body of some kind to bring everyone together, all the states together, to look at how cybersecurity can be enhanced. And there's very little mystery about the kinds of prohibitions that would be required in that kind of an international agreement. There are many arguments that were made then and continue to be made, although the less said it seems the better from the US government perspective. They try not to address these issues because there's so much against any kind of meaningful international cooperation, in my experience. But the problems can be handled. We concluded at that time, and over the years I've maintained the same positions. First of all, as Scott Charney pointed out in the last panel, I think very clearly, we have to limit ourselves to trying to solve those problems that can be solved. And the minister from China said the same thing. Let's be practical. No one is going to regulate internationally the intelligence gathering activities of our countries. No one is going to mandate internationally the military activities of our countries. There are treaties that govern what you can do militarily, but they're the laws of war. And they're there, and we're going to figure out what they mean in terms of cyber activities as we go along. We should be more open to that. We should be willing to talk about that more than we do. But those rules are there. So if you start directing yourself internationally to those functions that you actually may be able to get the kind of agreement internationally that you need to create a specialized agency of the kind that we have in many areas that have added enormously to security, you need to say, well, what are the areas in which we agree? And you could hear it from the Chinese minister here this morning. The financial sector, the energy sector, where if we don't have distributed energy protected, if we don't have our networks protected, how can we use distributed energy? We won't be able to. And this is an inherently transnational function. And if we don't have every player signed on to these standards that would govern these particular areas, we're never going to get anywhere. Now, the second objection is, how do you trust a UN-type agency to do something that isn't political to the point that it really is destructive rather than helpful? Well, we do. We trust the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. We trust the International Maritime Organization. There are a series of specialized agencies, the World Health Organization, that set international standards and protocols for the world by consensus. And those standards are developed in committees that are run, essentially controlled by the private sector or by technicians. And in our recommendation was to take the IETF, to take the private, very, very private orientation of the cyber area and build that into an international institution. And at this point, still, the U.S. would have the leverage to try to bring that about. We're losing leverage every year internationally as China and the other countries get together and push the ITU agenda. And it's not one I favor. I do not favor equal rights internationally where a majority of states could shove something down the throat of the United States. That is not the model internationally. The model internationally is either consensus or it is the major powers being allowed to veto things that are inconsistent with their interests. So being practical is part of any sound international structure. And so it is thrilling, actually, for me, after 10 years of being in the wilderness on these issues, to watch what's happening in the last couple of years. As China, Russia, India, these countries step up and say to the United States, look, There is no way we are going to be able to deliver a secure cyber system by acting alone. And when the United States finally believes that, as we finally did, incidentally, with biological weapons, with chemical weapons, when we realized the world was going to get those weapons, nuclear weapons, if we didn't do something to control them, to regulate them internationally, we are going to make some progress in this area, and it's very important that we be practical. Now, one more word, and that is the issue of privacy. How do we deal with countries that do not have the level of freedom that we have, and at the same time give them the security that we want? Well, let me take aviation, because I mean, this applies everywhere, but I'll give you the aviation model. We agree with China, with Iran, with anyone and everyone, that no one is supposed to bomb a civilian airplane or interfere with it or take it as a hijacked plane. We agree with that. We criminalize that activity internationally. And what we do when we end up with a prisoner in our hands that has committed that kind of a crime in China or in the former Soviet Union, where we actually had such a case, what we do is we prosecute him instead of extraditing him. There's a fundamental principle that we build into these treaties to enable us to maintain our values, not subject him to the due process that he was going to get in the Soviet Union, which would not be very good. We prosecuted such an individual ourselves, even though he hijacked a plane in order to get free from what we regarded as a tyranny. It was a crime, and we prosecuted it. And that is the way, I think, that is one way that we can develop these ideas internationally, develop an international organization that can look at protocols and standards that would enhance security in specific areas where we all agree to do that, and at the same time maintain our commitment to privacy, liberty, economic freedom. Thank you.
Did you have a...
Yeah, I agree with many of Abe's points, and I want to come back specifically to the question of intergovernmental cooperation. I think something that's an area in which governments have a lot to learn from the private sector, in the sense that the private sector does a lot more with a lot less in international cooperation. The private sector collects a lot less data in the first place, and much more willingly shares it cross-border with their counterparts in order to foil cyber attacks. So governments, unfortunately, have very little to offer in terms of foiling online attacks, but in things like the Boston Marathon bombing, that's a very different case, where it's an offline attack, and that is clearly the responsibility and authority of government to try to thwart. So I think the governments holding on to data and thinking of data as something that they can't share with each other is tricky. And when they collect so much data, it becomes very difficult to share little bits of it, because sifting the appropriate little bits out becomes almost an impossible task. When you have only the appropriate data in the first place, it becomes much easier to share, much easier to work with your counterparts in other countries that you might not agree with on a lot of issues, and still come to a positive outcome. And I think that comes back to the question of the balance between the collection and the analysis. And sharing data and collaborating with other people who have other pieces of data to see where there's a useful intersection, that's on the analysis side, which is being underinvested in right now. Whereas collecting too much so that it overwhelms you and you can't share anything is the too much collection side of things, I think.
Well, I'm not suggesting that we need governments because they are the ones with the data and the ability to do this. We need governments because they're the ones with sovereign power.
Yeah.
They are the ones who can bless this kind of an operation, which I hope and which I would insist be controlled by the private sector rather than by governments. I think we need this to control our governments. Our governments are out of control. They are the ones who are giving us insecurity in massive doses. They are the ones who are insisting on intelligence gathering, on military activities, that are still aimed somehow at dominating the world, as though anyone is going to ever dominate the world in the cyber arena. And the biggest offenders of aviation security are governments. The Russians are the ones, the Soviets were the ones who shot down the Korean airliner. I mean, the biggest single offense in ICAO history. So I'm not under any illusion about what governments can contribute here beyond the sovereign blessing that would enable the world to get out from under this free-for-all, essentially a free-for-all that is going on, that is pointless, getting increasingly expensive, and is destructive to everybody.
So I think we have, actually I was determined to, we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Yeah, please. Somebody's going to come running with a mic. Several people are running with mics.
Mics are converging.
It's on.
Thank you. I was very interested in Mr. Woodcock's comment about the dangers of just aggregating big data. And I think he makes a very good point. But if private industry is aggregating big data for its own purposes, are you going to pass laws prohibiting that? After all, if the government aggregates big data, it may make mistakes, as we've recently seen, but presumably its security is a lot tighter than the security used by most private industry. So if you're really interested in privacy and the dangers of big data and criminals aggregating across databases, you should be passing a law prohibiting the accumulation of big data. In a world of modern technology, how are you going to do that?
So I think that passing a law to do it is one approach, and there are certainly many people discussing that. I agree completely that that kind of aggregation and warehousing of dangerous information is equally problematic regardless of where it happens, because criminals who would abuse it really don't care where it is. More problematic in the private sector. Indeed, more problematic in the private sector because there are financial incentives for abuse. And I think other approaches that are being discussed are liability approaches, both criminal and civil. So if there was a Snowden-style disclosure about data collected by, say, AT&T for its own purposes, you would find civil suits, right, that the government is essentially immune from. So AT&T carries liability insurance policies. In order to maintain those policies, they have to make certain assurances to their insurers about their practices. There are a set of checks and balances that are in place on the private sector internationally, which, you know, can arguably be said to either be working or not working, depending on your point of view. Admittedly, I'm not saying that that is a solved problem. What I am saying is that governments exempt themselves from many of the checks and balances that do affect the private sector. So although I think you're right, the potential for abuse is higher in the private sector, also the checks and balances, the recognition of the liability, and the internal protections are all higher in the private sector. So for instance, the reason why we don't have a lot of Snowden-style disclosures in the private sector is because the private sector treats security classification much, much more stringently than the intelligence community in the public sector. So you don't find people who get a security clearance and that carries them for 20 years with access to broad ranges of data that are inapplicable to what's necessary to do their work. By contrast, the private sector tends to maintain ongoing assessment of the need to know of each employee and the trustworthiness of each employee, and employees get sort of re-examined every time they move job to job.
Europe, as you know, we have a complete different approach, and as everybody knows, we do distinguish very clearly between what is personal data and what is not considered as personal data. Personal data are those that can be can be linked to a natural person, and those data are those at the center of our attention, at the center of our special protection. It is different if you're talking about, of course, atmospheric or environmental data or other kind of data. And I think that some, and of course we distinguish also sensitive data and non-sensitive data, sensitive being clearly data about race, sex, or sexual orientation, health issues. So I think some of this distinction, I've seen them also starting to be made in the US debate, but I think we come from approaches that are fairly different still. And maybe one of the advantages of having all these spotlights, if you want, on privacy versus security at the moment is that it will oblige us to talk more, discuss more, and learn more about the systems that we have in place.
Sadly, I'm afraid all the other questions will have to be done in the networking session to come. So please thank the panelists for a wonderful session.